Clara Monroe believed in three things: strong coffee, second chances, and keeping her heart locked away where no one could reach it. At 22, she had never let anyone cross the invisible line she drew around herself, not because of religion or old-fashioned values, but because touch meant trust, and trust meant vulnerability she could not afford in a city that swallowed people whole. The morning her world ended began like any other. She tied her dark hair into a messy knot, slipped into worn canvas shoes, and crossed 3 blocks of cracked Brooklyn sidewalks to reach the Bluebird Cafe, where steam clung to windows and regulars knew her name before she asked for theirs. Her hands moved with practiced grace, pouring espresso shots and sketching tiny birds in foam while her mind wandered to the canvas waiting at home, half-finished and full of dreams she was too afraid to complete. Carter Sterling arrived at 7 sharp, same as always, with his bright laugh and wrinkled shirt that spoke of all-night research sessions and deadlines he chased like they were adventures instead of obligations. He was sunshine in human form, the kind of friend who remembered her birthday when she forgot it herself, who walked her home through rain and snow because he said the world was safer with company. To Clara, he was the brother she never had, the one person who made the hard city feel a little softer. She never asked about his family. Carter spoke of his childhood in pieces, fragments of summers spent in houses too big to fill with warmth, of an older brother who lived in a different universe entirely. Clara understood that some stories hurt too much to tell completely, so she never pushed. Besides, her own family was simple enough, just her and her father in a tiny apartment above a laundromat, where the smell of detergent mixed with the scent of her mother's memory, fading but never quite gone. The first crack. Thomas Monroe had been a good man once. Clara held on to that truth like a lifeline even as evidence suggested otherwise. He worked as an accountant for companies that paid well and asked few questions, and after her mother died from cancer that came too fast and stole too much, he took whatever work kept food on the table and lights burning through long, lonely nights. Clara never questioned the extra money or the envelopes that arrived with corporate logos she did not recognize. Daughters trust their fathers first and doubt later. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, official and cold, stamped with government seals that made her stomach twist. She hid it beneath a stack of takeout menus and pretended it did not exist. The second letter came 3 weeks later, thicker and heavier, with words like investigation and compliance that turned her mouth dry. Her father sat at their small kitchen table and stared at the paper as if reading a language he once knew but had forgotten. He smiled at her and said everything would be fine, but his hands shook when he poured his coffee, and Clara knew fine was just another word for not yet broken. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. So she swallowed her fear and went to work and drew hearts in foam for strangers who tipped well and forgot her face before they reached the door. The night the city changed. When the agents came, they came with cameras and handcuffs and questions that fell like hammers. Clara was closing the cafe when Carter called, his voice stripped of all its usual light. He told her to come home immediately, and she ran through streets that blurred with tears she refused to let fall until she was alone. Her father stood in their small living room, surrounded by men in dark suits who spoke in acronyms she did not understand. Federal charges. Securities fraud. Evidence of money laundering through offshore accounts. The words crashed over her like waves, relentless and drowning. They led him away in handcuffs while neighbors watched from doorways, and Clara stood frozen, unable to move or speak or breathe as the man who sang while cooking and carried her through snow when she was small disappeared into the back of a black car. Carter found her on the floor an hour later, still wearing her work apron, staring at nothing. He sat beside her without speaking, just being present the way good friends do when words fail. Finally, he said something that made her blood run cold. Carter told her about his brother. Not the fragments and pieces he usually shared, but the full truth. Nathaniel Sterling, billionaire CEO of Sterling Global Enterprises, a man who built empires and crushed competitors before breakfast, who lived in a penthouse above the city and moved through the world like he owned every inch of it. Carter had been hiding from that legacy his whole life, choosing journalism and cheap apartments over trust funds and corner offices, but now he said his brother was the only one who could help. Clara wanted to refuse. Pride told her to find another way, to hire a lawyer she could not afford, to believe the system would see her father's desperation instead of his crimes. But Carter gripped her hands and said time was a luxury they did not have, that by morning her father would be transferred to a federal facility where visiting hours were measured in minutes and hope died in fluorescent-lit rooms. So she agreed. The car arrived at midnight, black and silent, with a driver who knew her name before she gave it. Carter rode beside her across bridges that stretched over water dark as ink, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to say. The Sterling building rose like a knife-cutting heaven, all glass and steel and cold ambition made solid. In the lobby, security guards nodded as if they had been expecting her, and elevators carried them up and up until the city became a carpet of lights far below. Behind the glass. Carter stopped at the private entrance to the executive floor. He touched her shoulder and said he was sorry, that whatever happened next, she would always be his friend. Clara nodded even though sorry felt like a word too small for the moment. The doors opened, and he stayed behind. The office waited at the end of a long hallway, all black marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned Manhattan into a living painting. Behind a desk of dark glass stood Nathaniel Sterling, and Clara understood immediately why people spoke his name in whispers. He was tall and perfectly still, dressed in black that made him look carved from shadow. His face was beautiful in the way cliffs are beautiful, all hard angles and dangerous edges. When he looked at her, his eyes were the color of winter storms, cold and assessing and missing nothing. On the screen above his desk, news footage played on loop. Her father in handcuffs. Agents surrounding him. Cameras flashing like lightning. Clara felt her knees weaken but forced herself to stand straight. She had come here for help, but Nathaniel Sterling did not look like a man who helped anyone without taking something in return. He studied her for a long moment, and Clara felt exposed, as if he could see past her clothes and skin straight into the fear she carried like stones in her chest. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was quiet, controlled, more dangerous than shouting ever could be. The price. 6 months, he said. Become my fiancée, and I will make your father's charges disappear. Refuse, and he spends the next decade in prison. Clara stared at him, unable to process the words. This could not be real. People did not offer deals like this outside of movies and books. But Nathaniel reached into a drawer and placed a small velvet box on the desk between them. Inside, a diamond caught the light and scattered it like broken stars. Your body remains yours, he continued, as if reading her fear. This is business, not romance. You will live where I place you, appear where I decide, and play the role I require. In 6 months, we part ways. Your father walks free. You return to your life. Simple, nothing about this was simple. Clara looked at the ring and felt her future narrow to a single point, sharp and inescapable. She thought of her father alone in a cell, of the way he used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings and tell her she could be anything. She thought of all the years she had guarded herself, believing safety came from keeping people at a distance. Nathaniel pushed a contract across the desk. Her name waited at the bottom, and beside it, a pen that felt heavy as iron when she picked it up. Outside the windows, the city burned with a million lives that continued without pause. Inside this room of glass and power, Clara Monroe signed her name and felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, because she had not given that away. But her freedom, her choices, her carefully built walls. The pen made a small sound against paper. Nathaniel closed the contract in the box, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite regret. Not quite relief. Something human hiding beneath the mask. You start tomorrow, he said. Clara nodded because her voice had fled. As she turned to leave, Nathaniel spoke again, softer this time, almost kind. This is not a fairy tale, Clara. Do not expect a happy ending. She met his eyes and saw the truth there. He was not a prince. She was not being rescued. This was survival, cold and calculated and sharp. The elevator carried her down through floors of sleeping offices, and Clara wrapped her arms around herself as the city rose to meet her. Everything had changed. Nothing could ever be the same. Somewhere above, Nathaniel Sterling stood at his window and watched her car disappear into traffic. He told himself this was just another transaction, just another move in games he had been playing since he learned to walk. But the image of her signing that contract, the way her hand shook and her eyes stayed dry, followed him into the dark hours of morning. In the back of the car, Clara pressed her forehead against cold glass and felt the ring burn against her finger like a brand. Tomorrow, she would wake up in a different life. Tonight, she mourned the girl who believed keeping herself pure meant staying safe. The city moved on. It always did. The penthouse existed in a different reality than the one Clara had known her entire life. It occupied the top 3 floors of the Sterling building, suspended above Manhattan like a kingdom made of glass and silence. When she arrived the next morning with a single suitcase holding everything she owned, the doorman knew her name and the elevator required a key she did not possess. Nathaniel's assistant, a sharp woman named Victoria with silver hair and eyes that calculated everything, handed her the key without smiling and said she would be living on the 2nd residential floor. Clara stepped into a space so vast and white it felt like walking into a cloud. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire level, turning the city into wallpaper. The furniture was minimal and expensive, all clean lines and neutral tones that whispered money so old it did not need to shout. Her bedroom alone was larger than her entire Brooklyn apartment, with a bed that could fit 4 people and a closet that echoed when she opened the door. She set her suitcase on the pristine white duvet and felt like an intruder in a museum. Everything smelled new and untouched, as if no one had ever lived here, only existed in careful, controlled ways. Through the window, she could see her old neighborhood somewhere in the distance, small and impossibly far away. She pressed her palm against the glass and felt the cold seep into her skin. This was her life now. At least for 6 months. Learning to pretend. Victoria arrived at noon with an army of stylists, personal shoppers, and a woman who introduced herself as an etiquette coach. Clara stood in the center of her new bedroom while strangers measured her body, debated her skin tone, and discussed her hair as if she were a mannequin instead of a person. The stylist held up dresses that cost more than a month of rent and spoke in a language Clara did not understand, hemlines and silhouettes, seasonal palettes and designer politics. She wanted to scream. Instead, she smiled and nodded and let them transform her into someone she did not recognize. By evening, her closet held more clothes than she had owned in her entire life, all perfectly tailored, all carefully chosen to make her look like she belonged in Nathaniel Sterling's world. The etiquette coach was a tiny woman with perfect posture named Grace. She taught Clara how to walk in heels that felt like weapons, how to hold a wine glass, how to make small talk with people who measured worth in zeros and connections. Clara learned which fork to use for salad and which topics to avoid at dinner parties. She learned to smile without showing too much emotion and to laugh without making too much noise. It felt like erasing herself one lesson at a time. The first appearance. Their first public outing was a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum, the kind of event where photographers waited outside like hunters and guest lists read like Forbes rankings. Victoria dressed Clara in midnight blue silk that flowed like water and made her feel naked despite covering everything. Diamonds borrowed from some vault Clara would never see hung cold against her throat. Nathaniel arrived at her door at 7 sharp, dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than her father's legal defense. He looked at her without expression, and Clara could not tell if he approved or simply did not care. He offered his arm, and she took it, her hand trembling slightly against the expensive fabric. In the car, he gave her instructions in that same quiet, controlled voice. Stay close. Smile when appropriate. Do not discuss your past or your father. Let me handle all questions. You are my fiancée, not my equal. Remember that. The word stung, but Clara understood. This was not real. She was playing a role, same as he was. The gala was everything she feared. Blinding camera flashes. Shouted questions. Nathaniel's hand firm on her lower back, guiding her through crowds that parted like water. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks over rooms filled with people who wore their wealth like armor. Everyone wanted to meet her, to understand how a nobody from Brooklyn had captured the attention of the most powerful bachelor in New York. Clara smiled until her face ached. She made small talk about art and travel and pretended she had opinions about things she had never experienced. Nathaniel stayed beside her, silent and watchful, his presence both protection and prison. When an older woman with too many diamonds asked how they met, Nathaniel answered smoothly, through his brother, a friendship that became something more, love that surprised them both. The lie sounded so natural that Clara almost believed it herself. Cracks in the ice. Late that night, after the gala ended and they returned to the penthouse, Clara found Nathaniel standing at the windows of his office on the top floor. She had meant to go straight to bed, but something pulled her upward, curiosity mixed with exhaustion and the strange need to understand the man who had bought 6 months of her life. He did not turn when she entered, just kept staring out at the city below. In the darkness, with only the glow of Manhattan for light, he looked different. Smaller somehow. More human. "You did well tonight," he said quietly. Clara moved closer but kept distance between them. She noticed things she had missed before. The tension in his shoulders. The way his hands gripped the edge of his desk as if holding himself steady. The faint shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of nights without sleep. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question escaped before she could stop it. "You could have any woman you wanted. Why force someone into this arrangement?" Nathaniel was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, and his voice carried something she had not heard before. Weariness. Because real relationships require things I cannot give. Trust. Vulnerability. Time. This way, everyone knows the terms. No one gets hurt. Someone always gets hurt, Clara said softly. He finally turned to look at her, and in the dim light, his eyes were not cold winter storms but something sadder. Oceans that had forgotten how to be anything except deep and dark and lonely. "Then we make sure it is not us," he replied. Days became weeks, and Clara learned the rhythm of her new existence. Mornings alone in the vast penthouse, afternoons with Victoria going over schedules and appearances, evenings beside Nathaniel at dinners and galas and functions that blurred together into a parade of false smiles and careful words. Photographers followed them everywhere now. Gossip columns debated their relationship, creating stories from glances and touches that meant nothing. But something was changing. Nathaniel began appearing at breakfast, sitting across from her with his coffee and newspaper, saying nothing but no longer avoiding her completely. He asked about her day in ways that seemed almost genuine. When she mentioned missing her art supplies, new canvases and paints appeared in a room he had converted into a studio without asking permission. One evening, she found him looking at a painting she had started, a dark cityscape full of shadows and light. He stood there for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different. Softer. "You see the city the way I feel it," he said. Beautiful and brutal at the same time. Clara set down her brush and studied him in the fading light. The perfect mask he wore for the world had slipped, just slightly, and beneath it she glimpsed something unexpected. Loneliness. The kind that came from being surrounded by people and still feeling completely alone. "What happened to you?" she asked. "To make you like this?" Nathaniel's expression hardened immediately, walls slamming back into place. "That is not part of our arrangement," he said coldly, and walked away. But Clara had seen enough. The man everyone feared was not made of ice. He had just been frozen by something that hurt too much to thaw. When the past refuses to stay buried. Carter called every few days, his voice bright and worried in equal measure, asking how she was surviving in his brother's world. Clara lied and said she was fine, that everything was exactly as agreed, just business and appearances and nothing more. She could not tell him the truth because she did not fully understand it herself. Her father's case had indeed disappeared from the news. Nathaniel's lawyers, an army of them, had made the federal charges evaporate like morning fog. Thomas Monroe was released from detention, placed under house arrest in an apartment Nathaniel provided, forbidden from leaving until the arrangement ended. Clara visited him once a week, sitting in the small living room that smelled nothing like home, lying about her happiness while her father apologized for mistakes that had cost her everything. She forgave him every time. What else could a daughter do? But at night, alone in her enormous bed with the city glittering beyond the glass, Clara felt herself changing. The girl who had guarded her heart so carefully was learning that walls built from fear eventually became prisons. Nathaniel Sterling was supposed to be her captor, but somehow they had both ended up trapped in a cage made of contracts and carefully maintained distance. And the most dangerous thing was that Clara was starting to wonder what would happen if they stopped pretending. If they let the walls fall and saw each other as something more than business partners playing roles for the cameras. The thought terrified her more than anything else in this strange new life. Because in 3 more months, this would end. She would return to Brooklyn and small apartments and coffee shops where nobody knew her name was ever linked to sterling fortune. Nathaniel would move on to whatever billionaires did when arrangements expired. But hearts, Clara was learning, did not understand contracts. They did not care about timelines or terms. They just felt what they felt, reckless and inconvenient and absolutely real. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The night everything changed began with rain. Not the gentle kind that whispered against windows, but the violent summer storm that turned Manhattan into a blur of water and reflected neon. Clara stood in her studio, brush in hand, staring at a canvas she had been working on for weeks. The painting showed 2 figures on opposite sides of a window, reaching toward each other through glass they could not break. She had not meant it to be about them. Art had a way of revealing truths the mind tried to hide. Nathaniel found her there past midnight, still dressed in his work clothes, tie loosened and hair slightly disheveled in a way that made him look younger. He had been in meetings all day, the kind that decided the fate of companies and thousands of jobs, but he came to her studio instead of his bedroom, drawn by light under the door and something he probably could not name. "You should sleep," he said, but made no move to leave. Clara set down her brush and turned to face him. 4 months had passed since that night in his office when she signed away her freedom. 4 months of learning each other's rhythms, of breakfasts that grew less silent, of evenings where conversations stretched longer than necessary. 4 months of pretending for the cameras and forgetting to stop pretending when they were alone. "So should you," she replied. The rain hammered against the windows, and in the space between them, something electric hummed like a wire pulled too tight. Nathaniel looked at the painting, really looked at it, and Clara saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "We are running out of time," he said quietly. 2 months remained on their contract. 8 weeks until Clara would pack her single suitcase and return to a life that no longer fit. The thought made her chest ache in ways she did not want to examine. The truth that cannot hide. What Nathaniel did not say, what neither of them could say, was that somewhere between charity galas and quiet breakfasts, between his unexpected kindness and her gradual trust, the arrangement had stopped being pretend. Clara felt it in the way he touched her back when guiding her through crowds, fingers lingering a moment too long. She saw it in how he watched her paint, studying her face instead of the canvas. She heard it in his voice when he said her name, soft and careful, as if it were something precious he was afraid to break. And she knew he felt it too. Knew it in the way he found excuses to be near her, in the vulnerability he let slip when he thought she was not paying attention, in the careful distance he maintained as if afraid of what would happen if they got too close. Clara had kept herself untouched for 22 years, believing safety came from walls and distance. But Nathaniel Sterling had walked through every defense she built, not with force but with patience, with small kindnesses that accumulated like snow until she was buried in feelings she had promised herself she would never allow. "I need to tell you something," Nathaniel said, moving closer. His voice carried weight that made her pulse quicken. "About why I made this arrangement." Clara waited, barely breathing. 5 years ago, he began, I was engaged. Her name was Jessica. We met at Harvard, dated for 3 years, and everyone said we were perfect together. I believed them. I bought a ring. I planned a wedding. I thought I understood what love meant. The past tense hung in the air like smoke. Clara did not interrupt. 3 weeks before the wedding, I found out she had been selling company secrets to our competitors for 2 years. Everything was a lie. The relationship. The love. All of it was just access to information worth millions. When I confronted her, she laughed and said feelings were just another currency, and I had paid too much for too little. Clara's heart cracked for him, for the younger version of Nathaniel who learned to trust and paid for it with betrayal. After that, he continued, I decided never to let anyone close enough to hurt me again. Business I understood. Contracts were clear. Arrangements had terms. But then my lawyers told me the board wanted stability, a personal life that made me seem human instead of a machine. So I created this. A relationship with clear boundaries. No risk. No feelings. No one gets destroyed. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw everything he was not saying written in his eyes. But I failed, he whispered. Because somewhere in these 4 months, I forgot this was supposed to be fake. When hearts refuse to hide. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Rain continued its assault on the windows, and Clara felt her carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. She had spent years protecting herself, believing that staying untouched meant staying safe. But safety was just another word for lonely, and she was tired of living in fear of her own heart. I forgot too, she said softly. Nathaniel closed the distance between them in 2 steps. His hand came up to cup her face, gentle and questioning, giving her every chance to pull away. Clara did not move. Could not move. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and the touch sent electricity through her entire body. This was not part of the plan, he said, his forehead touching hers. Plans change, Clara breathed. When he kissed her, it was nothing like she imagined her first kiss would be. It was not soft or tentative or sweet. It was desperate and hungry and full of 4 months of wanting what they could not have. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, and Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she had been holding inside. She had saved herself for 22 years, and in that moment, she understood why. Not because of fear. But because she had been waiting for this. For him. For love that felt like falling and flying at the same time. They stumbled from the studio to his bedroom, shedding clothes and inhibitions, learning each other with hands and mouths and whispered words that sounded like prayers. Nathaniel was gentle despite his hunger, constantly checking that she was okay, that she wanted this, that she chose him not because of contracts but because her heart refused any other option. Clara gave him everything. Her body. Her trust. Her carefully guarded heart. And when they finally came together, skin against skin, breath mingling in the darkness, she felt complete in ways she never knew she was broken. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like rain and new beginnings, and Nathaniel held her like she was the most valuable thing he owned. Which, Clara realized, to him she probably was. Not because of agreements or arrangements, but because she had seen past his walls and chosen to stay anyway. I love you, he said into her hair. I do not know when it happened. Maybe the first night when you signed that contract and looked at me like I was human instead of a monster. Maybe this morning at breakfast when you laughed at something on your phone and the sound made everything else disappear. But I love you, Clara. And I do not want this to end. Clara turned in his arms to face him. The city glowed beyond the windows, indifferent to the revolution happening in this bed, in this heart, in this moment that changed everything. "I love you too," she whispered. "And I am terrified. When the truth destroys." They had one perfect week. 7 days of stolen mornings and tangled nights, of finally being honest about what they felt, of planning a future beyond contracts and timelines. Nathaniel spoke to his lawyers about dissolving the arrangement and making their relationship real. Clara called her father and heard hope in his voice for the first time in months. But secrets have a way of rotting from the inside out. Carter came to the penthouse unannounced on a Thursday afternoon. Clara was in the kitchen making tea when she heard raised voices from Nathaniel's office. She crept closer and heard her best friend shouting words that made her blood freeze. "You bought her. Like she was property. You blackmailed her into this arrangement using her father as leverage, and you have been lying to me for 4 months." Clara's hand went to her mouth. Carter knew. Somehow, he had discovered the truth. "It is not like that anymore," Nathaniel said, his voice strained. "It was business at first, but we fell in love. What we have now is real." "Real?" Carter laughed, bitter and broken. "You do not get to claim love when you started with coercion. You took my best friend and turned her into another acquisition. Into another thing you could control." The door flew open and Carter stormed out. He stopped when he saw Clara standing in the hallway, and the betrayal in his eyes cut deeper than any blade. "Did he force you?" Carter asked quietly. "Please tell me this was your choice." Clara wanted to explain. Wanted to tell him about the desperate midnight when she had no other options, about how what started as survival had transformed into love. But the words stuck in her throat. "Carter," she started. He held up a hand to stop her. "I thought you were happy. I thought he was treating you well. I had no idea this whole thing was built on blackmail and desperation. My own brother. My best friend. And both of you lied to me for months." Tears streamed down Clara's face. "It is not like that. Not anymore. I love him." "How can you love someone who bought you?" Carter demanded. "How can you trust someone who started this relationship by threatening your father's freedom?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable and devastating. Carter left without another word, and the silence he left behind was deafening. Nathaniel tried to hold Clara, but she pulled away, her mind spinning with questions she could not answer. Had she fallen in love with her captor? Was what they shared real, or just Stockholm Syndrome dressed up in expensive clothes and penthouse views? The doubt poisoned everything. That night, she slept in her own bed for the first time in a week, and the distance felt like death. Nathaniel did not push, did not demand. He just gave her space and looked at her with eyes full of pain he had earned. Days passed in awful silence. Clara visited her father, who had heard about the fight from somewhere, about the truth spreading through social circles like wildfire. Thomas Monroe looked at his daughter and asked the question that mattered. "Are you happy with him?" Clara opened her mouth to answer and realized she did not know anymore. Yes. No. Maybe. How could she separate the happiness from the coercion, the love from the leverage? "Then the choice is yours," her father said gently. "Not mine. Not Carter's. Not even Nathaniel's. You get to decide what your heart wants, regardless of how it started. We all make mistakes, Emmy. The question is whether the love that grew from those mistakes is worth fighting for." Clara returned to the penthouse that night and found Nathaniel on the balcony, rain soaking through his shirt as he stared at nothing. She walked out into the storm and stood beside him. "I need you to release my father from the arrangement," she said. "Completely. No conditions. No strings. If we do this, I need to know I am choosing you because I want to, not because I have to." Nathaniel turned to her, water streaming down his face mixing with what might have been tears. "It is already done," he said hoarsely. I called my lawyers 3 days ago. Your father is free. You are free. You can leave right now, and there will be no consequences. I will not stop you. Clara looked at this man who had learned to love despite believing it was impossible, who had broken his own rules and torn down his own walls for her. She thought of all the reasons she should walk away, should choose safety over risk, should guard her heart the way she always had. Then she thought of how his hands felt on her skin. How his laugh sounded in the morning. How he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. I am not leaving, she said. I am choosing you. Not because of contracts or fathers or anything except this. She kissed him in the rain, and it tasted like salt and freedom and futures they would build together with honest hearts. The city watched and did not care. But two people on a balcony high above Manhattan rewrote their story from transaction to truth, from arrangement to forever. Some love stories begin with fairy tales. Theirs began with desperation and bloomed into something fiercer and more real than either had dreamed possible. And that, Clara thought as Nathaniel held her close, was its own kind of magic.